and as a political movement. If the Shia political Islamic current has some demands, they have to sit down with other political currents to reach a consensus regarding these demands.
The International Federation for Human Rights estimates at least 89 people have been killed in 3 years since the start of that uprising in 2011. Venezuela's president says police are searching for an opposition leader.
Voy a seguir en el poder porque el pueblo está en el poder.
Thousands of people gathered for a pro-government rally today. Supporters and opponents of the government have been staging rival protests across the country. Police used tear gas and water cannons on protesters who set fire in the streets overnight. Al Jazeera's Rachel Levin sent us this update from the capital.
Tens of thousands of people came out today for a pro-government rally here in downtown Caracas that President Nicolas Maduro has called. Now, the rally was supposed to be a pro-peace rally. People really came out with their families. There was a very carnival atmosphere that we saw. But despite that, the president had some pretty harsh words for the leader of the opposition. Earlier this week, the government issued an arrest warrant for him. And on Saturday, President Nicolas Maduro ordered the police to go and obtain him. Now, meanwhile, across town, the opposition held its own separate rally, also a rally for peace. However, the numbers there were far fewer. There were between 1,500 and 2,000 people. Now, the tension here in Caracas and around the country is still very high, following the deaths early this week on Wednesday of 3 people that were killed during an anti-government protest. That protest turned violent, and also dozens of others were injured. Now, those deaths have been condemned by human rights activists and people within Venezuela. The government has said that they are conducting an investigation, but so far nobody has been arrested in connection of those deaths. So people here are really bracing themselves and waiting to see how the next few days play out, if tensions continue to rise, or if, true to the president's calling today, there will be a more calming on the streets and a more peaceful attitude.
And the deaths of 3 protesters this week have increased tensions across Venezuela. It's been a difficult year for that country. Last March, President Hugo Chavez died from cancer. His vice president, Nicolas Maduro, then took over. Less than a month later, Maduro was elected president, but the opposition refused to recognize the results and demanded a recount. In October, Maduro expelled 3 U.S. diplomats. He accused them of trying to sabotage the country's electrical grid and destabilize the economy. Then the next month, Maduro tightened control of the country's foreign exchange in an attempt to tackle shortages and inflation. Later that month, the National Assembly allowed Maduro to create laws without going through lawmakers. And in December, students protested a new law that would give the government more control over universities. And last month, the government announced changes to the nation's foreign currency rate, with Maduro also calling for an increase in gas prices that had not changed in more than a decade. Joining us from Philadelphia to talk about this is George Ciccariello-Maher. He's a professor of political science at Drexel University and the author of the book, We Created Chavez. Professor, thanks for being with us today. So, Venezuela is a country long plagued with problems. Where is this anger coming from now?
Well, the reality is that this is an anger that's been simmering in certain sectors of the opposition for years. And what we're actually seeing in these protests is a shift within the Venezuelan opposition. If you recall, even your report referred to Leopoldo López as the leader of the opposition. But just a few months ago, that person would have been Enrique Capriles, who is considered to be a slightly more moderate representative of the opposition. But what you're seeing now on the streets, alongside many well-meaning students, is a really ferocious right wing of the opposition movement that has not recognized the Venezuelan government, that hasn't recognized previous elections, and that has in the past even participated in coups against the government.
So does that mean the opposition is becoming better organized and better able to voice their concerns and their complaints and rally people in the streets?
I don't think that's true. What you're seeing is the kind of disintegration of the unity of the opposition that was put together behind Capriles' presidency. And what you're seeing is kind of a desperate lashing out with regard to calling all these people into the streets, knowing that there will be violence. We should recall that Capriles learned an important lesson after the April elections. When he lost, he was calling people into the streets to protest those results, and 10 people died, most of them Chavistas. And so he learned, I think, at that point that you need to be very careful when calling out people into the streets, into these kind of clashes, and yet there are other sectors of the opposition that are attempting to use this as a political ploy to assert their leadership over the opposition.
So where do you think this is going to go? Where will this lead Venezuela?
I think the reality is, if you look at the numbers of people who turned out on Wednesday, they're actually relatively small. This is an opposition that in the run-up to the coup in 2002, that in the run-up to the referendum in 2004, was able to get many hundreds of thousands of people into the street. And now you have actually much smaller numbers. And so you have a sort of diminishing minority of people who don't recognize this government and who don't recognize the fact that they are a minority. And so I think the reality is the government's going to play a soft hand in this and let these protests really taper out.
So, but when you consider the fact that inflation is a major problem there and crime is a concern, why do you think the opposition movement, aside from the fact they're not very well organized and having issues there, but why do you think this is not rallying more people across the country?
The reality is that the opposition doesn't represent an alternative. If you look at the political policies that they would institute, they would actually represent a return to a neoliberal past, a past in which many Venezuelans remember suffering, starving, 60% in poverty. They remember some of the most severe conditions. And so until this opposition can really present an alternative, in other words, a new way forward, which is what Capriles was attempting to do, although he slightly unsuccessfully, the energy is certainly going to remain in the Bolivarian camp. But that's not to say that Maduro and that the Chavistas aren't capable of losing some of that energy. That also happened in April. The reality is that the Bolivarian leadership, the government leadership, really needs to be able to energize its own base. It needs to show that it is an alternative, and this is happening on the ground in social movements with the building of communes, but it also requires stabilizing some of these macroeconomic questions with regard to inflation and the exchange rate.
And so, considering that, do you expect the United States to get involved at any point here?
Now, the United States continues under Obama to fund the Venezuelan opposition in the same way that they did under Bush, and actually had been more open. Obama has been more open about sending funds to this opposition, despite the fact that some of them have very questionable human rights records and questionable records with regard to democracy. But we're not going to see, I don't think, the United States government intervening in a very direct way. As a matter of fact, Leopoldo Lopez, the person who's really trying to make a run for the leadership of the opposition, is someone that the U.S. Embassy described as a sort of megalomaniac that can't be trusted.
Okay, George Ciccariello-Maher with Drexel University, thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Jurors in Florida are struggling during their fourth day of deliberations in the Michael Dunn murder trial. Dunn is accused of killing unarmed black teen Jordan Davis during an argument over loud music. It's a case that has highlighted the issues of race, guns, and stand your ground laws. Natasha Gadame is live outside the courthouse in Jacksonville with more on this. So Natasha, what's happening today?